Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we have the second part in our 7th Continent How to Play series. This is going to cover all the gameplay aspects. The first part gave you an overview of all the cards, which I thought was necessary because of how many different types of cards are in the game. And the first part also covered the setup. This is going to cover all of the gameplay. As you can see, I've got everything on the table here, got the box here. We have just finished filming this, and I am very excited to bring this to you. I do want to first mention our sponsor, Board Game Co. This is a great website where you can buy, sell, and trade games. They have a great selection of games for you to choose from to purchase. They really help you build out your collection. They also have a great system for taking games off your hands. They will buy games from you. They give you a very competitive price compared to what you might find with other online retailers, so be sure to check that out. The really cool feature is the trade feature. If you have a Board Game Geek account with a trade list already set up, with a wish list, that has what you want in trade, what you have for trade, then they can actually link into that list and then compare it to their inventory and build out a trade list right there on their website for you to use to facilitate a trade. Now, if you don't have that Board Game Geek account, you don't have a wish list set up there, not a problem. It takes a little bit of extra work on your part to get a trade set up with Board Game Co., but it's definitely doable as well. So be sure to go check them out. If you do, click on the link in the description below so they know I sent you over there. Board Game Co. makes it easy to buy, sell, and trade your way into a better collection. All right, let's get down to the game topper, and I'm going to show you how to play the 7th Continent. A turn in the 7th Continent consists of 3 basic steps. First, the players must choose the active player. This player is collectively chosen by all players and may even be the same player as the previous turn. There is no turn order in 7th Continent, and technically speaking, one player could take multiple turns in a row over and over and over. If for some reason the players cannot reach a decision, then the player to the left of the last active player becomes the active player. Next, players check for any other involved characters. Here, we obviously only have one character on the board, but if there were 2 players playing the game, or 1 player playing 2 characters, then the second character could become an involved character in the action the active player is about to take. To do this, the character must be on the same terrain card as the active player, and the active player must agree for the other player to get involved in the action. By being involved, the other player now may use cards in their hand and or their inventory to help the active player. Finally, the active player resolves the action of their choice among those visible and available to them. An action can be identified by a white square like this. The actions available to a player are any that are on the terrain card their figure is standing on. On this terrain card, the options available to the player are the Go See or Investigate action and the Move or Backtrack action. Exploration cards always have at least the Pathfind Escape action. Some exploration cards will have temporary events, which may have actions on them as well. Permanent events likely will have actions on them. Actions can be found on skill cards, state cards. Certain bonus cards have actions. Some item cards in a player's inventory have actions. And certain quest cards have actions. Regardless of where the action is located, once the action has been completely resolved, a new turn begins. This player reference card provides a list of all the various actions in the game, as well as an idea of the action consequences based off the different symbols you'll find. And then on the opposite side, players will find exactly the order of action resolution, which we're about to cover here in a moment. Also, some more specifics about the various types of action icons. It's important for players to remember that an action cannot be taken if another action is currently in progress, if it has a prerequisite that players cannot meet, if it has the stairs icon, as you see here, and one or more players is not involved in the action, if the action is visible in the placement arrow of a permanent event attached to a terrain card the player's figure is standing on. That action icon will look like this, where it's golden, indicating the action has been taken to create that permanent event and no longer is viable. Also, when the active player reveals this symbol, it means the action is mandatory. All involved players must first finish resolving the current action and then immediately resolve that mandatory action. An action is resolved using the following sequence. The first step in the action resolution is the item step. Each player involved in the action may use one or more of the items in their inventory by removing one pip from the value of the die resting on each used item. So if the player was wanting to use the move action to move up here, and they wanted to not have to pay the cost, you can see this will supplement a move action. They would move this down to 3, and now you subtract 2 from the cost of the move action, so it would not cost anything. Items will frequently consist of more than one item card, as you can see here. Regardless of how many item cards make up the item, the value of the die is still reduced by only 1, even if the player ended up using abilities from multiple cards in the stack. To be clear, each of these is an item card, but the stack is one item. For each item used this way, the player will be able to apply some or all of the effects of one or more of the cards it consists of, as I mentioned. The key is that the brown icon used must match the action currently being taken. So keep in mind, white icons are the actions, brown icons supplement the white icon actions. A brown icon can never initiate an action. Effects from items may be used at most once during the action. Also, if players wish, they may move the die to the artwork of any item they are using as a reminder the item is currently in use. Once all items have been declared for use with the action chosen by the active player then determines the cost of the action. The cost of an action is the number of cards that are going to be drawn from the action deck. As we mentioned, the default cost is the number found in the blue diamond. Besides using items, there are a couple of other ways to modify this cost. If more than one player is taking the action, so for instance, this climb action, the players may decide to lower the cost of the action by any number while increasing the difficulty of the action by the same amount. So, for instance, they might choose to subtract 1 from the cost of this climb action and increase the needed successes by 1. That would make this climb action a 0 cost, 3 success action. The players might do that if they had this card in their hand, which provides 2 successes, and this card in their hand, which provides a third. However, keep in mind that this option for lowering the cost and raising the difficulty is never available to the players if this lock icon appears with the action. Each player involved may apply the effects of one or more cards from their hand, one or more permanent event cards attached to the terrain card the figure is standing on if it has some way of helping, and or one or more quest item cards in order to decrease the number of cards drawn. Once the final cost has been determined, the active player draws a number of action cards equal to that cost and places them face down in front of themselves. So if they were trying to take this climb action, and let's say that they did not lower the cost at all, then they would draw 1 card. The active player may then draw additional cards if they wish to boost their chances of succeeding, unless the action has a red lock. Any such additional cards are placed face down next to those previously drawn. It is possible for the cost of an action to be 0, as we've mentioned, but it may never be less than 0. In cases where it would be lowered below 0, it is still considered just to be 0. Generally speaking, the player will be drawing cards from the top of the action deck. However, if the action deck is empty, the active player must shuffle the discard pile, place it face down, and draw from it randomly instead. Once the player has drawn the cards from the cost step, they reveal all the cards drawn. If a curse card is revealed and it was drawn from the action deck, it has no effect. If the player were drawing from the discard pile due to the action deck being empty, the players now lose the game and the game ends immediately. Otherwise, the player totals the successes that they have obtained. Successes are only represented by full gold stars. Half stars may be combined as long as they each form a separate half of a star. So in this case, the player would have drawn 0 successes, and since that climb action required 2 successes, they would have failed. However, if instead of this curse card, the player had drawn this think card, you can see those stars come together, and now the player has 2 successes. But if instead of this rudimentary flint, the player had drawn this war paint, these 2 halves do not match, and so this would only be 1 success, and the player would have failed the climb action. In order to gain additional successes, players can use cards from their hand, such as Forewarned is Forearmed. This would be the success the players would be gaining, not the successes on the left side of the card. The left side of the card is only ever used when the card is drawn from the action deck. Players may also gain successes from items in their inventory that were used during the item step of the action, such as these down here. Certain permanent event cards attached to the terrain card they are currently standing on may provide additional successes, and quest item cards may provide additional successes. Let's say the player had used this rope to assist in the climb. This 7 with a star behind it indicates that every 7 card drawn from the action deck will count as a success. So you can see there's 1 7 on this card here, so that actually is considered a success as well. So these 2 cards, the rudimentary flint and the think card combined, are 1, 2, and then 3 successes thanks to this star 7. Keep in mind that if a star 7 was not activated, then the 7s don't count for anything. If the player obtains at least as many successes as necessary, then they will resolve this portion of the action. Otherwise, it's a failure, and they resolve this portion. On the bottom of page 13 of the rulebook, players can find a chart showing the likelihood of drawing a certain number of successes depending on how many cards are drawn. It's important to keep in mind that this chart only references actual successes on the initial 35 skill cards. It does not take into account the lucky 7 icons, any character-specific skills, or any advanced skills. After determining the number of successes obtained, the active player may choose 1 skill card among the skill cards that were revealed during the results step. The player may add that card to their hand or the hand of another player involved in the action, even if the card exceeds their hand limit. A skill card that is specific to a particular character may only be added to that character's hand. Let's say that the player chose to add Rudimentary Flint to their hand. After selecting the skill card they're going to keep, the player then discards everything else. Keep in mind, a curse card may never be added to a player's hand and so will always be discarded. Also, if an item had been completely used up during that action, then the entire item is discarded into the discard pile. Certain items may come from exploration cards such as this one, or even adventure cards. When those need to be discarded, they are discarded into the past, not into the discard pile. After the players have discarded all cards that need discarding, the active player applies the consequences of the action depending on their result. So, if the player had succeeded at this climb action, they would draw card 026 and would have discarded this card. On the other hand, if they had failed, you would follow the instructions here. Each involved character takes a 104 card. 104, you can see it's a state of being injured. Some actions do not have a failure consequence. If that's the case, then there literally is no consequence for failing. Unless stated otherwise, the consequences of an action always only apply to the active player. Also, if an action with several involved characters is a failure, the active player must take a 100 card as well. Paranoid. Finally, after resolving the consequences of the action, any involved player who has more skill or bonus cards in their hand than the authorized hand limit must discard the excess of their choice. So now let's discuss in detail some of the various consequences the players are likely to encounter as they explore the 7th continent. One of the most common, as you've seen, is to take a numbered card as a consequence of the action. When taking a numbered card as a consequence of an action or an event, the active player must take it from the adventure deck. Often, several cards may match the same number. When this happens, the active player randomly takes one of the green cards and then reveals it. However, if all of the green cards are gone and there's only gold cards of the number left, the player must instead take the gold card. It's very important to note, however, that gold cards may only be pulled if there are no green cards of the same number in the adventure deck. If a player only sees a gold card, they can double check the past or the banished card dividers to see if the green version of that card is there somewhere. If there is no green card of that number behind either of those dividers, it's likely the player has filed the card in the wrong place and the player should figure out where it is. As I've mentioned, there is flavor text on the back of these adventure cards, but players really should take note of this, as often the flavor text contains details that can be helpful to the players during the game. In the rare case that no card, green or gold, with the specified number is available to the player, they must immediately return all adventure cards in the past to their place in the adventure deck, and shuffle all the exploration cards in the past back into the exploration deck. The player then takes the newly available card as explained previously. If several involved players are supposed to take a numbered card, then the active player takes their card first and resolves it before the next player in clockwise order does the same, continuing in this way until all involved players have the necessary card. If a Numbox comes with a blue banner, as you see here, or a purple banner, similar to that one, the active player may either take a card matching the number of the Numbox, or take a card whose number is equal to the number in the Numbox plus the associated number with the pictograph in the banner. So, if the player had a pictograph with those banners on a different card, such as these two cards here with a 6 and a 6, then we'd have 12 plus 21, which is 33. Keep in mind, this may only be done if one of the involved characters is using an item or a quest item which also shows the same pictograph and the associated number. In other words, you can't just add these to any Numbox. It must specifically be the one that has these same symbols attached to it. Once the adventure card has been revealed, the player will find it is one of several different possibilities. If a terrain card is drawn, the active player must put this card into place by placing it on the indicated location. Terrain cards must always be oriented the same way as all the other cards on the board. Once that terrain card is in play, the active player must then place new exploration cards as indicated. And one would go here as well if I wasn't out of table room. If a permanent event is drawn, the active player must put this card into play by placing it on the board attached to the terrain tile where the action that drew it is. The placement arrow here must point towards that terrain tile. The card also will be oriented in the same way as all the other cards. This permanent event is now attached to the terrain and represents additional actions that can occur on that terrain. This means that any actions, resources, or effects shown on the event are now available to any player whose figure is on the terrain card. As we've mentioned previously, this icon reminds the players what action they took to draw this card in the first place, and now means that the action on the terrain card is no longer an action that can be taken. Keep in mind, players do not actually move on to permanent events. Instead, this permanent event is on this terrain card. It's just a sort of zoomed in version of it. As you can see, these peaks here are the peaks right here. If a temporary event is drawn, the active player must resolve this event immediately and then discard it into the past. Sometimes a temporary event will actually say that it's banished, as you see here. If that's the case, the players will banish the card rather than discarding it into the past. If the temporary event shows the white box surrounded in red like this one right here, The players must take the action right after the current action has been resolved, and they don't have a choice. Also, no other player may get involved that wasn't already involved in the other action that led to this. If an item is drawn, the active player may add this card to their inventory, placing a die on it just like any other item, or they can combine it with an existing item in their inventory. We'll discuss more about combining items in the combining an item section of this video. The player may also give this drawn item to another player who was involved in the action so that this player adds it to their inventory instead. Or they may simply discard this card into the past if they do not wish to keep it. One thing they may not do is add it to their hand, however. As you can see, an item drawn from the exploration area and also often from the adventure deck will not have this blue hand. The Satchel and Journal only provides a number of blue and green hand cards, meaning skill cards and bonus cards, that can go into a player's hand. Since this card doesn't have either of those hands, it cannot go into your hand and must go into the inventory or be discarded. Sometimes a player may draw a quest item, and they must then slip this card underneath the Satchel and Journal like any other quest item. If the player does draw a skill or bonus card, as you can see here, this is a bonus card, they also may add this card to their hand. They may also give this card to a player who was involved in the action, and that player could then add the card to their hand, or they may discard it into the past if they do not wish to keep it. Keep in mind that technically this one was drawn from an exploration card, not from a Numbox, but the idea is the same. State cards may or may not have this blue diamond with an X through it. If it does have that icon on it, then the players must immediately discard as many cards from the top of the action deck as they have red hand character or state cards, remembering that their character card has a red hand. However, if there is an effect that actually prevents the character from gaining the drawn state card in the first place, then this icon has no effect. As usual, if there are no cards in the action deck, the player must randomly reveal cards from the discard pile instead by flipping it over and shuffling it before doing so. As long as the game doesn't end as a result from the discard pile, all drawn cards are then returned back to the discard pile since they are discarded. After resolving any necessary discarding, the player adds the state card to their hand. There is no maximum hand limit for state cards. If the player already has a copy of the state card that they have now just drawn, they actually return the original one back to the adventure deck and keep the new one. If several players must take state cards at the same time, the active player does so first, and then the next concerned player in clockwise order until all necessary players have taken one. Sometimes the players may have to take a card in the adventure deck without the card being summoned by an actual Numbox. For instance, if the players find a hidden number, or if they add up the number of a Numbox with the number in a blue or purple banner, as you see here. When this is the case, a thumbs up icon with a Numbox must be seen on the back of the new adventure card. So 21 plus the 12 from these two equals 33. Here we have card 33. With this thumbs up for 037. This number must match the card that the players originally were on that brought them to find this card. If the new card does not have this icon, then the player must have taken the wrong card and must return it without looking at it. When the consequences of an action or event instructs the player to discard a card, that player must immediately put that card into the discard pile if it's an action card, or place it in the past if it is an adventure or exploration card. When the consequence of an action or event instructs the player to banish a card, the active player must immediately remove that card from play and store it behind the banished cards divider. It's important to realize there's a big difference between the past and banished. Cards behind the banished divider will not be used for the entire remainder of the game, while cards in the past will come back into play under certain circumstances. If the card to be banished has any green cards available, then the green one must be the one to be banished. Gold cards are only ever banished if there are no green cards of the same number to be banished. When this icon appears in the consequences of an action, the active player must banish the green card and immediately replace it with the gold card of the same number. When the consequence of an action instructs the player to return a card, the active player immediately places that card back into its original deck. In this case, back into the adventure deck. If the consequences of an action instruct the players involved to lower the value of one or more dice resting on item cards in their inventories, they may distribute the indicated amount of loss of durability in any way they like across the several items in several inventories. So if they need to lose 3 durability, they could lose 1 from the bow and then 2 from here. As you might expect, if this resulted in an item's durability being lowered to 0, it can no longer absorb any more loss of durability, and all cards forming that item must be discarded. If the consequences of an action instructs the player to move a figure or figures, this will be done following the normal rules of movement. The action deck represents how much life force the whole group of players has. As long as there are cards in the action deck, players will draw action cards from the top of the action deck. If they draw a curse card, it has no consequence at this point. Players always discard cards into the discard pile face up. The discard pile may be examined freely at any time. When an effect enables players to put cards back into the action deck, either randomly or chosen, these cards are shuffled back into the action deck. When the last card in the action deck is removed, players must then shuffle the discard pile and place it face down. This is still a discard pile and is not a new action deck. For as long as there are no cards in the action deck, during the call step of an action, the active player shuffles the face down discard pile and draws cards from it. If at any point a curse card is drawn from the discard pile, the game ends immediately and players lose. Anytime a player discards a card while the action deck is missing, players will discard directly into the face down discard pile and shuffle the cards into it. When players are instructed to discard from the action deck for any reason, they instead reveal cards from the discard pile and then shuffle them back into the discard pile. But if one of these revealed cards is a curse card, the game ends. When an effect allows players to shuffle cards back into the action deck from the discard pile, they reform the action deck with the corresponding cards. At this point, players will resume drawing from the action deck as normal, and the discard pile will return to its normal face-up position. If a player ever needs to draw more cards from the action deck than are in the deck, they will draw as many as possible and then begin drawing from the discard pile in the manner that we've just finished discussing. An exploration card is a random event that hides a portion of the continent. An exploration card is a random event that hides a portion of the continent. The player needs to resolve it in order to remove it and put the appropriate adventure card into play. This is the way players will explore throughout the entire continent. Once the exploration card has been resolved and then discarded, the active player must put an adventure card into play, replacing it. The number of the adventure card must match the Numbox associated with the arrow on the terrain card that points towards the newly opened space. If that adventure card is a terrain card, the active player must make sure that it fits with the adjacent terrain card like a puzzle, and then put out any new exploration cards. As you can see, this one has no additional exploration cards. However, over here, you can see an exploration card would go here and here. It's very important that the Roman numerals on the exploration card always match the Roman numeral on the terrain it's attached to. In the bottom left of the terrain card the character finds themselves on, there will always be a symbol indicating how that character can move off of the terrain card they're currently on. While there are a couple different icons for movement, all of them should be red. All involved characters move their figure to the same reachable terrain card. A reachable terrain card is one that is connected to the active player's terrain card by an uninterrupted series of terrain cards, no matter how many there are. So, both of these are reachable from the player's current position, And if the player were here, both of these would be reachable. However, it may happen that some permanent events, such as this one, may separate two terrain cards. In this case, these events feature an action, as you can see right here, whose consequence is to move the figure to the terrain card on the other side of the obstacle. In these cases, this permanent event would interrupt a move action, so a player may not cross it using this action here. And instead, they would have to stop and perform the necessary action to cross. So what this means is, if the player used this action to move, they could, with that one action, move here, or, again, starting here, they can move all the way to here, because it's a reachable terrain card. However, the player could not move from here all the way to here because this permanent event gets in the way. The player would have to stop here, perform this permanent event, and then cross. The crossing is a result of this action, not a continuation of this action. It's possible that some cards may refer to north, south, east, and west, and players should always assume that these cards are oriented with north being up, south being down, etc. If players do find a terrain card that has a mandatory action on it, players who arrive on that card must immediately take the action unless it can be no longer taken for some reason. Some terrain and permanent event cards contain hidden numbers. When players find one, they may discard the card on which it is spotted and replace it with a card bearing that number. As you can see right here, there is 014. The player would draw 014, see that 006 is right here, double check they did in fact find the hidden number on 006, and put 014 in its place. The original card is discarded into the past. A hidden number will always be written with 3 digits, just like any number in a numbox. The terrain can quickly become pretty sprawling in the 7th continent. When there is not enough room on the table to put a card into play, all characters must meet on the same terrain card, and then players must return the terrain cards of their choice along with the permanent events attached to them, making sure that all remaining terrain cards are still reachable. The remaining cards are repositioned to the center of the table. Players should make sure that all edges of the terrain have the appropriate exploration cards in play. When an item card is in a player's hand, it is not actually an item yet. It's more like the idea of an item. The craft action found at the top of item cards enables the player to turn that skill card from an idea into an item that goes into their inventory or another involved player's inventory. Craftable items are made of various resources, as you can see here, bamboo and stone. When a player has access to some or all of the resources indicated on the item card, such as stone on this terrain card, the player may reduce the number of cards to be drawn during the cost step of the craft action. So, by having access to stone, it will actually cost 2 less to craft this deadfall trap. It is important to note, however, that even if the player has access to none of the resources indicated, they still may craft any item in their hand. The resources simply make crafting cheaper. Keep in mind that anytime the fire token is on the player's terrain card, they are considered to have the fire resource. Once the craft action has been successfully performed, the active player may create a new item by adding this item card to their inventory and placing a die on it for the indicated number. Or the player may combine the item card with an existing item in their inventory. Combining items allows the players to have more cards in their inventory, make the initial item more efficient and versatile, and possibly increase its durability. When an item is combined with another item, they form one single new item. It's important the player does not exceed the stacking limit, which is set by the player count on the satchel and journal card. The new item is placed at the bottom of the column, and it is added, making sure that the lower part of the card remains visible so that the effects and keywords may still be seen. If the new item shares at least one keyword with the very top item card of the column, its durability value is added to the value of the die to a maximum of 6. Now you can see here that the bow's keyword is will and the deadfall trap is aggressiveness, so no additional durability is added. However, if instead the deadfall trap were added to the bolus, then its 2 durability would be added to this one, making it 3, because both have the aggressiveness keyword. If the player does not wish to create a new item or combine the item card, then immediately after crafting it, she may give it to another player who was involved in the craft action, and then that player must either create a new item or combine it. A player may relinquish an item from their inventory at any time. In doing so, the die is removed, and all cards the item was made from are discarded. A player may never voluntarily deconstruct an item, meaning taking a single card from an item stack. The only exception is if a card actually has an ability causing this to happen, such as using the bolus, it then says discard this, and so the bolus would be discarded. I've mentioned it before, but just to be clear on exactly how it works, a player may use an item in their inventory by lowering its durability by 1. Doing so allows the player to apply some or all of the item's effects when they are involved in an action to which those effects apply. So in the case of this deadfall trap bolus, the player could use it for hunting with both cards in the column, or for resting using just the deadfall trap, or for attacking using just the bolus. If the item actually featured an action itself, it could be used for that as well. Characters on the same terrain card may freely give or swap one or more full items. Keep in mind this means that all the item cards in a column must be swapped. However, every time an item is given or 2 items are swapped, 2 cards must be discarded from the action deck. When a player receives an item in this way, they may not combine it with another item they already have in their inventory. Players may suspend and save the game at any time as long as all characters are on the same terrain tile. Also, in order to save the game, no player may be performing any action at the time. First, the player should discard all cards on the board into the past, with the exception of the terrain card the players are currently on. Next, the remaining cards must be stacked in the following order from the bottom up. Any skill, bonus, or state cards in the player's hand go underneath their character card. For each item in the player's inventory, orient a save card so that item's durability is at the top and place it on top of that item stack. Make sure that the item stack remains in its original order. These go underneath the character card as well. Additional characters may be stacked on top of each character. The discard pile is then stacked on top of them. The action deck is stacked on top of that. Then the satchel and journal with any quest cards underneath it. And finally, the terrain card that the characters were standing on. Take this stack of cards and place them behind the save tab. To resume a game after saving it, first return all the cards in the past to their original locations in either the adventure deck or the exploration deck. Next, remove the saved cards from their location in the box. Put the saved terrain card out and all characters on it. Put out any necessary exploration cards. Put the satchel and journal card into play with any quest item cards underneath it. Put the action deck on the table and the discard pile. Skill cards are reassigned to the players they belong to. Each player receives their character card with their hand of cards underneath it. And then that player's item cards are set back up. And finally, return all the save cards back to the box. The game ends and players win collectively if they manage to lift all the curses they chose to fight. The game will clearly let the players know when the curse is lifted. The game ends immediately and players collectively lose if one of the following occurs. A player reveals a curse card when drawing from the discard pile, or the consequence of an action that all players are involved in states your adventure is over. However, if one or more characters receive the consequence, your adventure is over, but not all characters receive that consequence, those characters that did receive it are eliminated. In this case, the eliminated players must discard all of their skill and bonus cards, discard all their item cards, return all their state cards, banish all skill cards showing their character's face, whether those action cards are in the action deck or the discard pile, and then the eliminated players may continue the adventure with a new character. To join a game in progress with a new character, the player must choose any character they were not already, shuffle that character's 5 skill cards into the action deck. The players then immediately apply the new hand and inventory size limits by discarding any excess cards and or items in their hand or inventory. And the new character is then placed on the same terrain card as the other characters. And if a player decides to leave the game for good, simply apply the eliminated character rule. So there you go. That's everything you need to know to play the 7th continent. Covered all your gameplay aspects for you there. Be sure to check out that first video if you haven't watched it yet to get the card overview and the setup. And until next time, if you're bored online, bored offline.